Which of these decks is the right way to go? Catch our segment Ahead of the Curve later in the show.
It only flops if it hops. Comment below as we walk through the Week 4 recap of Bloomburrow Standard. Alrighty, welcome back, Rebels. This week, we went through 6 tournaments, analyzing 48 top 8 spots, with a special emphasis on the MTGO Showcase, if only because it had 197 players compared to the other tournaments, all being below triple digits.
As you can see, Jeskai Convoke tops the chart, potentially ending the debate of which route is stronger. The Fast and Furious archetype snagged only 2 top 8 spots, but it took the trophy home in each case, including that MTGO Showcase Dark just told y'all about.
Next in line is Golgari Talent, featuring 6 top 8 slots and a trophy, highlighting its rise from mediocrity as the list solidifies and the meta evolves.
Yeah, and Dimir Aggro hung on for another week with 5 top 8 spots, though it couldn't secure a trophy. Nonetheless, the counter-tempo deck of Standard continues its journey to the top, proving its merit in raw top 8 numbers.
Last but not least, much like last season, we see Azorius Control start to emerge just as Domain begins to taper off, cementing itself with 3 top 8 spots and a trophy.
Down in Tier 2, we see Gruul Slickshot at the forefront, just narrowly missing Tier 1 status with 3 top 8s but no trophy. Now, before y'all go into the comments section and write how all 3 of those top 8 slots are in the MTGO Showcase, just remember that we're aggregating data across 6 tournaments. Gruul didn't make the top 8 of the other 5 at all.
And Domain fell on hard times this week, ending up in Tier 2 with 3 top 8s but no trophy and no path through the plethora of Speed Demon and tempo-heavy decks designed to hold it in check. Now, despite rotation max, this feels a lot like 3 months ago.
Oh, yeah. Now, Jeskai Convoke might have been our leader, but Jeskai Control was the spicy new hotness this week with 2 top 8s and a trophy, as Bloomburrow's control players caught onto the tech that is playing our favorite new planeswalker, Ral, the Crackling Wit. Otter Walkers are where it's at, fam.
And pulling up the tail end of this tier list is good old Mono Red with 3 top 8s of its own, though 0 trophies once more. Mono Red keeps on pushing, but we've not seen it break through with any regularity recently, and it feels like it's appropriately stationed over here in Tier 2 land, honestly.
Yeah, and over in Brewer's Corner, I'll be highlighting Sultai Midrange and Green Stompy.
And I'll be walking you through Orzhov Blink and Rakdos Claw.
Now, onto our Tier 1 archetype breakdowns, beginning with Jeskai Convoke.
Ura first managed to take down the 197-player MTGO Showcase Challenge last Saturday with Jeskai Convoke, marking a decisive shift to include blue in a Boros Aggro shell. So let's take a look at some of this. Now, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the mana base. There are 16 white sources, 14 blue sources, and 13 red sources. And this is good mathematically for what we are trying to accomplish turn by turn. For instance, Gleeful Demolition, not a turn 1 play, so 13 red sources means you are 90% on turn 2. The 14 blue sources ensures that you're 90% for that Spyglass Siren on turn 1, and the 16 white sources is an acknowledgement that you are going to occasionally need to, you're going to have to hit white on turn 1. So you need like a 95% ratio there, but turn 2 you might have to hit white, which 16 isn't quite enough to do at a 90% interval, but it can do it at an 80% interval. Let's also note that the Yodian Frontliner still made the cut, despite the fact that we played those Spyglass Sirens, and that we have the 3 Ward Leaders call back in this deck. We haven't seen that in a hot minute. That has been gone since we saw the Caretaker decks take off and all the enchantment hate come back.
Absolutely, and I predicted that War Leader's Call should come back. I think that card is critical to the success of this Convoke list. You already kind of answered the question that I had in mind, so tell the folks, let's take this opportunity to tell the folks about, you were discussing intervals. What is the Frank Karsten math? And my secondary question is, and I guess we know the answer now, but what does the deck need something like Thran Portal now that it's 3 colors?
So it's actually, the Thran Portal part I'll address first. The Thran Portal might be worthwhile depending on whether you want that basic plains to fetch. Because if you put a Thran Portal there, you're increasing red and blue up by another like 2.5% on their intervals while maintaining the white, okay? So if you don't care about Demolition Field at all, you could shift it to 1 Thran Portal, and I think that would be correct. But I've seen enough Demolition Field because of how rampant Restless Cottage, Fountain Ports, you know, we've seen all of these creature lands and Mirexes, they're coming through, so people on control have to play Demolition Field. So I want that extra planes personally, and I think the mana base is just fine as is. Now, Karsten math refers to Frank Karsten. He's a Pro Tour. I don't remember. I think he's a Hall of Famer. But either way, statistician in his work life, professional life, and he wrote basically the MTG Bible on how to break down mana-based math. So for all you people out there, we're gonna go ahead and link to that in the description below so that you guys can have a quick, route on over to it. It's not often we link over to other content creators, but when it comes to good, pure fundamentals, absolutely the Rebellion's here to help.
Yeah, and to answer your question, Frank Karsten, Hall of Famer class of 2009.
There we go. Fair enough.
Definitely earned that slot, I would say. But let's talk about a deck that has definitely earned its slot. Rising Star, Golgari Talent.
Golgari Talent's best finish was handled by none other than McWinsauce, taking the deck into the semifinals of the MTGO Showcase and earning its Tier 1 spot once more. Now, I actually took this for a little test drive this afternoon because I was really curious why this build, why not a different build, and we did a quick 3-0 in Mythic with it. So I can say that I like the way this is positioned because this is all about backdoor combos. You are primarily a Golgari midrange deck that has the ability to backdoor into a Vraska combo later in the game. And because of that, they have to respect the combo so heavily that they often give up position on the board in order to make sure innkeepers can't just come down and screw them. This gives you a unique ability to advance your board position while threatening and bluffing something bigger that's looming but may not actually be in your hand. And I love the way that this is positioned for that. So it does a good job of also taking care of Innkeeper's talent and recognizing that you need 2 Sentinel of the Nameless City. For the longest time, I'm like, why does this matter? Well, Deep Cavern Bat exists. The ability to pump up your lifelinkers and push them through is great. And if you have that map token hitting when Innkeeper's talent hits the final mode, it's 2 counters. That's +2/+2 permanently. That's not a small amount of help right there.
I really love this list. I really dig this archetype. It's very fun to play. I streamed it the other day. My question for you, I see the Liliana still heavily in use. Is Liliana still the one? What about the fact that we saw Balos increasing in sideboards everywhere? Does that card affect enough matchups to reconsider Liliana in your main?
I really like where Liliana's positioned specifically for this kind of Golgari deck because if you get Golgari Talent to the final level, Lily ults on impact. That means you don't have to worry about Baloth, you don't have to worry about anything else. You can just go hit it, ultimate, half your permanents are gone, or the most critical ones are gone on your opponent's side. And that is one hell of a push forward for Lily, despite Baloths coming in the sideboard. And let's not forget that it's in the main, so you're getting a huge advantage game 1 against Domain, for instance, by pushing that. And yeah, game 2 they bring in the Baloths. We may get to a point where we board Lilies out for game 2 and 3, and they board in the Baloths and we don't even care. Whereas like, yeah, have your Baloths, we don't care, we're not interacting with them whatsoever, that's just a 4-drop that gains you 4 life. So I could see that becoming the plan with Lily, where it's forcing them to respect it with Baloth, and then you get to have an extra 2 slots essentially because they have to respect Baloth, and you can move the Lilies back out.
Yeah, definitely do that. If you're expert piloting right there, be aware of what your opponent thinks might be able to contend with you and play around that. Let's talk about a deck that we discussed last week. I'm excited to see the changes this week. Dimir Aggro.
Alrighty, so DM4X made it to the finals of the MTGO Showcase before getting knocked out by Jeskai Convoke. So let's look at the list. It has solidified immensely. First of all, Plume Creed stuck the landing, but Malcolm did not. That's interesting to me. It tells me that the protection of Plume Creed ended up being more important than the filtering of Malcolm, and perhaps that's due in part to the fact that you're going to play mirror matches now, and when you play those mirrors, they have fairy masterminds. You don't really want to draw a discard and trigger their mastermind to just draw. Like, that's awkward if you're just triggering their masterminds for extra draws for them, and you still have to discard yours. Outside of that, let's note that 3 Steps Ahead got played in here as well, so we're bumping up the number of counters to 6 from 4 in previous weeks, and we're also bumping up those Tishana Tidebinders to 4. I like where this is at. Like, this highlights the fact that this deck is all about stutter stumping tempo, which it does. And those Tishana Tidebinders do a fantastic job of keeping Urbrask's Forges in check, or just buying you a turn against Caretaker decks, where you counter the ability that they're trying to push forward, that draw, and just clock right through. So I like where the deck is positioned.
Okay, I dig this archetype too. Golgari and Dimir have been my go-tos these past couple of weeks. But I want to ask a question about the 4-drop slot. For this particular point in the meta, why Sheldred over something like Archfiend?
I think Shelly makes a lot of sense when you consider that Dimir has to maintain game against Convoke, and it has to maintain games against decks that it can't necessarily swing through quickly, but it needs to be able to grind. And the beauty of Shelly is it presents, on its own, empty board, 3-turn clock against almost every deck, right? But against aggro decks, it's particularly damning because you're going to trade blows early on, and if you stick the Shelly at the end, they have to swarm. They cannot rely on getting through it any other way. They have to swarm past you. It presents a very difficult situation for most of those low-to-the-ground decks like Gruul Prowess, where, again, you're trading resources early. Maybe they end up with one Slickshot, you end up with one Shelly. You can probably race that. You know what I mean? Like, you're getting a nice tempo swing. It's almost a Baneslayer effect for you, really. So I think it's there because you aren't necessarily going to achieve victory in 3 turns after playing the card, which is where Archfiend screws you, but you absolutely get to grind harder with it.
Archfiend does screw you. I don't forget that, especially in light of Glissa being a thing as well. Okay. Let's talk about a deck that we also has been coming up in recent discussions. Is this deck going to stick the landing in Tier 1 and stay there? Azorius Control.
Now, Azorius Control snuck into Tier 1 land on the back of an 18-player store championship in the Philippines, so it's difficult to say if it's actually strong enough or just spiked for a week. But I'm posting it here in Tier 1 because I really like the innovation, and I think if we're going to build Azorius Control, this represents where I would personally start. Part of that is that this is a mill strategy boom bust. The diversification in mill is that you have a Realm Breaker to back up if they rip all the Jaces out of your deck game 1, and Realm Breaker will win that control mirror if it resolves, especially against Dimir Control. Because you have, deadly cover-ups. They might rip all those Jaces out, but you just land a Realm Breaker. They have no answers. You'll push right through them, I promise you. The other fun part here is Soul Partition. You may look at that and you're like, why? Why do we care about this card? Because you can go late game, Jace, -4, Soul Partition the Jace, replay Jace, -5. And I've had that happen to me, and it is brutal when it happens. Similarly, that's why Builder's Talent is in this deck, because it brings back Jace. And you can just keep going on this mill strategy. So if you're trying to play something that it's like Haterade with a mill strategy, this is the deck.
Wow. Okay. Thanks for talking about Builder's Talent. When I first saw this list a couple of days ago, I was thinking, why the Builder's Talent? But that makes a ton of sense if you're using mill as a secondary strategy here. My question for you, I thought about a card, Aven Interrupter. Does that synergize well with Soul Partition here? Is there room for this card in the main board or the sideboard?
There could be, but personally, that's not the strategy I'm trying to use, because what this Azorius Control deck is aiming for is inevitability. It's saying that no matter what you do, no matter how you position the game, all we have to do is get to the point where you've drawn half your deck and we will win the game. And that's really what Azorius... Sometimes you're going to hit for 45 off triple J's, but on average, your average game, you are just drawing it out till they hit 30 cards. And because all these people are on like Caretaker's Talent, that's common. They're going to keep drawing. They're going to keep on trading resources and draw more and more and more cards to try to keep up with you as a control deck, not realizing that they are just making it one Jace easier to die. So I don't want to go on damage-based effects, which is what Aven Interrupter is. It's a tempo card more than anything. It isn't a hard counter, right? So if we're going to do that, we would want a more tempo-based deck. This isn't really trying to do that even post-board. This is saying, we're playing Jace and you can't deal with it. And we're betting the bank that they can't deal with it. That's really where this deck is positioned.
Yeah, especially with Control, you have to be tunnel vision focused on what your strategy is, what your win conditions are. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. All right, that does it for Tier 1. Let's head on over to Tier 2, and I'll start things with Gruul Slickshot. All right, so this week we actually get to call it Gruul Slickshot instead of just, maybe possibly Gruul Prowess. We've got the full set of Slickshot back in here, so full reliance on this card. Now, I like where that's positioned. We're seeing experimentation with Patch Recruit. That's absent this week. That's not happening. They took those slots and brought them back, gave them to Shock. We have a full set of Shock. We're still using the 3 copies of Snakeskin Veil for protection, green-based protection. No questing druids this week. Very interesting. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. I thought that was a very effective card, but I see that this deck is a little bit more focused on just pushing through right away and not waiting around. So you've got the 4 copies of Manifold Mouse. These trigger Valiant. These give double strike to your slick shots. I think that's enough said right there. I like seeing Innkeeper's Talent scale back from 3 to 2. The card is a little bit slow for what you're trying to do with Gruul Aggro, but nonetheless, I think it's an effective card. So maybe 2 copies is the perfect amount. Credit to Mogged for the list, by the way.
So, Max, I look at this list and I see that we have, the 3 Snake Skins in the main, a couple Innkeeper's Talent, and then, there's 4 Pick Your Poisons and a couple Druids in the sideboard. But that's it. That is all the green cards in the list. Are we getting close to a point where we just don't even bother with the green and we say, okay, it's mono red? And in doing so, do we open up a line that we never used to have where we can play Rockface Village as a 4 of and give all of these creatures haste on average once we hit the later turns of the game? So that these mice, like the Manifold Mouse that you talked about, the Heartfire Hero, the Emberheart Challenger, they just all come in, haste, here we go, so that every creature has haste after turn 4. Is that worth it, in your opinion?
Wow, yeah. I think, honestly, here's where I'm going to play devil's advocate. I think when you consider how important protection has become, the fact that this deck has been on the radar for several weeks and months now, I think other decks are gunning for it, right? Even if it's a secondary defensive strategy, most decks have some kind of, well, here's a board wipe that hits the prowess cards. Here's enough single target removal that it's going to do damage. With Golgari, for example, I can pretty much just use the single target removal and win the game and grind it out, and they run out of gas. So I don't know if I want to give up the protection cards. I think there's a very important argument to be made for those. In addition to Innkeeper's Talent, I think 2 is a good amount. But we've also seen the red prowess decks out there, right, that are doing this kind of strategy that you're talking about. It is a dominant deck on Arena Ladder. However, we've seen that it hasn't been able to challenge Gruul's spot in terms of being the significant prowess list in the meta. So I don't know. I like the idea of a scaled back green and Gruul, but I'm not ready to give it up completely yet for the Rockface Village. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see.
Fair. And I mean, that 1-drop mouse that every time you target gets a +1/+1 counter, that is absurd if you go turn 1 mouse into turn 2 Innkeeper's Talent. Like, I had a person do that. I go for the throat, and I'm like, I just took 6 from a freaking 1-drop on turn 2. That felt awful.
Yeah.
But speaking of decks that will occasionally make you feel awful, let's talk about Domain.
Everybody's favorite Domain continues to roll through the Arena Ladder, especially, but nonetheless still making a mark on the competitive scene as well, despite only 3 top 8 appearances and no trophies. This list is from Batutina because 0 main board shifts this week from the last, so I have nothing to talk about with the main board. If you saw last week's State of the Meta, you understand how this deck is built. All the changes, however, are in the sideboard. We do have 1 additional copy of Nissa. I think that's significant. I think Nissa is a great planeswalker in terms of adding power to your board, but let's not forget the artifact enchantment hate here. Very important, which leads me to the 1 additional Frillback now making a full set. The importance of really the artifact enchantment hate continues to be a part of the narrative. We're going to drill it into your heads week after week, so long as Caretaker's Talent and Innkeeper's Talent are things. We still have a single Get Lost and a single Lockdown. We've changed over the 3 Elspeth Smite that were there last week and the 3 Baloths to 2 copies of Beza and 2 Tidebinders. I think these are both for the grindier matchups and especially for the mirror.
So, Max, I look at the top 8 of the Showcase Challenge. 3 Gruul Prowess decks. Dimir's up there, too. No Domain is there. Convoke won it. Like, those are super fast decks. Are we at the point where Domain has to lose Beanstalks and Jaces in the main and just focus on taking down aggro game 1? Have we hit that part of the meta?
I think we might have. We'll have to see how things shift, but my prediction is that it's going in that direction, at least a little bit more so than it has been. Jace is going to be a great sideboard card. I think it's great to grind out the mirror. But now, while it may be tougher to replace a card like Beanstalk, we have already seen Domain in past week experiment with something like Paw Patch Formation. If you recall the build that we saw week 1, that also had Aclazotz and Hostile Investigator in it, so that was a more aggressive version of the deck. I don't know if we want to go back to specifically those cards, but I would love to see more experimentation from Domain along these sorts of lines. Deck has gotten stale, if I'm being quite honest. I think that's a recurring story with Domain. If it's going to survive the onslaught of low curve aggro and then mid-range power that we're starting to see in Standard really take lately, we need to be willing to really push the envelope with this deck. So personally, I've experimented with Discover mechanics, Trumpeting Carnosaurs, Chimils. If you don't want to go that route, Sphinx of Clear Skies is another card nobody is playing. It's a lesser known domain card. Bonehorde Dracosaurs. What I'm really getting to is that these are cards that without a proper answer can come to dominate board states and really take over the game. So if domain goes in that direction, who knows?
Fair. And now let's take a look at an archetype that, unlike domain, has evolved in major ways, I think 4 times now in 4 weeks, and talk a little bit about Jeskai Control.
All right, Jeskai Control, several top 8s, and this shiny new take on Boros Control, I think it has potential. Now, how is this build different than the Boros build? Let's take a look. We have, of course, 2 copies of 3 Steps Ahead, already taking advantage of the blue. You have your ability to counter spells, right? That's obviously very important here, but also copying tokens. We have 2 copies of Builder's Talent, does create a token, does incentivize playing your Planeswalkers and your Sunfalls, and also acts as a way to resurrect Planeswalkers, as we pointed out earlier with Jace. In this case, you've got Ral, you've got Elspeth. So I think that's a pretty awesome play when you get to pull that off. Beza is here to help you catch up with all those low curve aggro decks, to help you catch up and then get ahead. Ral can make your Lightning Helixes lethal. In some cases, that can become your win con. It's very easy to get to that ultimate in most games, I think. The main board, Destroy Evils, Get Lost, Braids. These are your required artifact and enchantment hate, and we're seeing them in the main board.
So this is the second time we've kind of started to look at Builder's Talent in a Caretaker's Talent deck, and obviously, with Ral plussing and also putting down tokens, we've seen how Archangels and Rals have finally come to the forefront because of Caretaker's Talent. Now, Builder's Talent, is it strong enough to merit its slot in this list, and if so, why do you think so?
It kind of reminds me of another card from Old Standard that doesn't see any play in Pioneer, that 2-drop Meletus Builds the Wall or something like that. I can't remember. I think that was the name. It kind of reminds me of that card. And for that reason, right, it presents a hurdle to low curve aggro. I think that phase 1 is awesome. The card does have potential, like we pointed out, but I'm going to be quite honest with you. I'm going to have to test it myself and see. It does create that buffer between you and aggro. It brings back that Planeswalker on the final phase. I like the idea of this card, but I need to test it to find out if it really deserves its slot. So the verdict is still out for me personally.
That's fair. I mean, this is a brand new card, hot on the meta. And speaking of decks that are hot in the meta, let's talk about Mono Red Aggro.
Red Aggro, 3 top 8s, no trophies. It's fair to say this deck has struggled, but let's see what adjustments have been made with this iteration by Fukotuko Kasuto. We have, in the 1-drop slot, 4 Hired Claws. That's not something you've been seeing lately from Mono Red. I think the success of this card in Lizards is starting to bleed over into Mono Red, and it does Mono Red things as well, so I think it works here. We've got 13 pieces of single targeted removal, including 2 copies of Witchstalker's Frenzy. I just want to point that out. So that's heavily invested in that. And then main board, we've got 2 copies of Sunspine Links. Really, this card targets domain, targets complex mana bases. We're starting to see 3-color decks that splash for blue now, for example, a couple of Jeskai lists, so maybe this makes sense. We've got 4 main board copies of Forge. We know this card's history of being able to grind out with your tempo and your control list, your go big list. And speaking of go big, we've got 2 copies of Koth back in the sideboard. Really trying to go big when we need to. And then interestingly enough, the 2 Elder Dragon Wars in the sideboard as well. I just want to point out, it's not just a board wipe, right? You can read ahead and it has those multiple phases.
Now, I noticed in the sideboard, Max, that there are 2 Monstrous Rages just sitting there, and that's uncommon. Usually we see 4 of them in the main, or we don't see any. So why is there a 2-2 split in this, and when are we bringing those in?
I found that interesting too. My theory is that you just need it for that extra push to go underneath decks like Domain, decks like Golgari. It kind of speeds up the clock if you got that creature on board. And so I think what you do is you take out some of your single target removal if you're playing against like Tempo or Control or a deck like Domain that doesn't put out creatures early, and you slot in the 2 Monstrous Rages just to speed up the clock a bit.
Fair. And with that, we get to move to my favorite segment every week, Brewer's Corner. Let's kick things off and talk a little bit about Orzhov Blink. Alrighty, so I'm going to credit the whole MTG Rebellion Discord with helping me pull this concept together. I'm sure various people emailed me different iterations of this, but the point is, as a group, we worked on this together. So, what is this deck doing? It's praying your opponent doesn't have an Obstinate Baloth. I can guarantee you that, because if they have Obstinate Baloth, this deck is kaput. But if they don't, you have a lot of early interaction that's going to severely reduce resources, and to that, it feels kind of like a classic Jund deck. Like you are trying to grind resources down for both sides and then pull ahead with something like Zoraline or Braids or Viper or Lily. But everything else is just sack a creature, let's bounce it back and do it again, or let's bring it back with Zoraline and do it again, or let's sacrifice it to Braids and get a little extra value. And you have that same thing with Witch's Vanity, with Hopeless Nightmare. And you, of course, have Bandit's Talent as kind of an alternative way to pressure what they're doing while simultaneously reducing resources, right? I love where this deck is pulled together, and if you look in the sideboard, there's combos, the Profiteering Mayor. That to me is going to be a fun way to try to combat the resources that are shifted against you by Boros Talent. So we'll wait and see if it's actually good or not, but I have a theory it will be.
Orzhov is becoming a very popular color set, and we're seeing quite a few different builds. I think up to 3 or 4 now, if you count this one. So yeah, I'm interested to see what the evolution of this list is. Let's talk about a color set that we don't see very often, Sultai Midrange. Credit to Christian13, who achieved 2nd place in a 46-player MTGO challenge. So we have a winner on our hands already here. We've got, I want to talk about this card. This is really the main reason that this is Sultai, right? We're splashing for green. I want to point out first that Fabled Passage makes it possible for you to splash for a 3rd color pretty easily. So having that back in standard definitely helps. But we're splashing for Glarb. Right off the rip, right? You get to play things off the top, cast spells, mana value 4 or greater. And then also tap to Surveil 2. And I think the Surveil 2 is pretty good because you get to Surveil 2, overturn something big, which you're going to have big things in the deck because of that ability. And it synergizes with the 3 copies of Virtue of Persistence. You know, late game, you get to bring some of those things back. Let's talk about some of the things in the 4-drop slot that we have here. We've got the 2 copies of Hostile Investigator. We've got Shelly. We've got an Urtai. Vren, which is a pretty good card against low curve aggro. And a single Aclazotz that you can also play with Glarb. In the sideboard, typical package of Eclipse for the aggro, Negates for the spells, and then access to Terra Sunder. So that's the advantage of going Sultai as well.
Fair. And let's not forget that Vren can almost single-handedly race Urabrask's Forges, because then every time they sack, you get a token. So that's it's not a small thing to be able to do when they play Forge and you go, Vren, and I'm actually winning this race now. Love that. Love that. But let's move it right along. Let's take a look at Rakdos Claw. So, credit to Mother of Halflings for sending this build on over. This is all about abusing the infamous Gruul Claw. I think the entire Discord has been trying to break this card for a very long time. Like, ever since we saw this spoiled, we're like, okay, there's got to be a way to do it. And this one, it takes the Reanimator approach, which I really like. You know, the ability to Gruul Claw and push your way into a pull and grab back Calamities, Carnosaurs. It's kind of like a Smuggler Surprise variant, the way this one is designed, where we're aiming for more of a Reanimator vibe, but you have a better early game, I think, than the Smugglers do, because you get to play cards like Brotherhood's End, you get to play that early removal. And it's fascinating to me that we go even farther up the curve post-board, and we can get into Breach the Multiverse. And I'm sure that if you get to play Breach the Multiverse off infamous Gruul Claw, that, you know, Wizards will just send you a golden chain or something and let you know that you've won at Arena because you've finally done the thing that's the coolest thing you can do in Standard right now. At least that's my theory.
Achievement unlocked.
Right.
No, I really like this list, and credit to Mother of Halflings. Me and her personally talked about how to build this the best, and I see that she went ahead and did it. And one of the things I want to point out too is we were talking about what to do with the 2-drop slot. I think Charming Scoundrel was a good choice because you get to use that treasure token to ramp up into your bigger stuff if you need to. I know Bitter Reunion's also in there, and it was kind of a toss-up between 4 copies of Bitter Reunion or the Charming Scoundrel, and I think the Scoundrel won out. So nice list, nice list. Let's talk about a list that's near and dear to my heart. Credit to Hermes for Green Stompy. All right. I knew if this was going to be a deck, it was going to have to be one of those like full set, full set, full set, like 9 cards full set, basically, or something like that, to be perfect. And we've got almost close to that here. Almost full sets of all 3 of some very strong 1-drops in the Scout, the Adaptive, and the Paw Patch Recruit. All of these are very strong 1-drops. I think it's a good foundation for mono green. We go into Keen-Eyed Curator in the main board. Honestly, there's not enough graveyard hate in the game right now, and that's been pointed out week after week in our Discord, and I think players are starting to notice. I think this is a good time for a card like Keen-Eyed Curator, which kind of acts like a bigger Scavenging Ooze. We've got 4 copies of Innkeeper's Talent, 2 copies of Hunter's Talent. Hunter's Talent gives you some extra bonuses in addition to just being a fight card. Sharp-Eyed Rookie works really well going into cards like Sentinel, and Scrap Shooter. Scrap Shooter, of course, giving you that necessary main board artifact enchantment hate. And then the best top end card you could have for mono green, Nissa, right? We already talked about all the different modes on Nissa, but ultimating with Nissa is typically how you win with mono green.
Fair. And I haven't had a chance to test that one out, but it looks spicy. I like where it's trying to position itself, which is going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, for those just tuning in, we introduced this last week, and we used this segment to synthesize all of our analysis into 2 viable options for you to take to your tournament this weekend. Now, Max, we looked at 12 archetypes tonight. What are you playing going into week 5 of Bloomburrow Standard?
We've seen a healthy meta for the past 3 weeks since rotation. Now, it may not be healthy if you want a single deck, the one that you're playing, one single archetype to dominate, but it is healthy if you like a variety of decks making it to the top each week, and games being won or lost, not just in the deck building phase, but also with expert piloting. So for this week, I choose Golgari Talent. Golgari Talent, as you know, the Innkeeper's Talent deck, I think scaling it back to 3 is very optimal here. Sometimes it's just not a great card for you to have multiple copies of in your starting hand or in opening hands. So 3 Innkeeper's Talents, 3 Planeswalkers to match. We've got 2 copies of Vraska, 1 copy of Nissa. Nissa, again, we've been praises of Nissa. 3 copies of Sentinel. I think this is a great card to keep up with aggro. The Vigilance just helps a ton. And then I went with 4 copies of Archfiend of the Dross. I think this is a great card against aggro, your Slickshots, your Deep Cavern Bats, your Prowess decks. I also love the Game 2, Game 3 Massacre Worm effect you get when playing something like Miasma. So penalizing token builds, killing off tokens with it, I think is really good. 1 copy of Terra Sunder, necessary, at least 1 in the main board for all your artifact enchantments. I like where Long Goodbye is positioned. Mother of Halflings pointed this one out to me, that if you're seeing a lot of Steel Seraphs, maybe Flesh Gorgers even, this is a good card for that. And also Liliana. We've got flex slots early on, which you can switch into Pick Your Poison, Dreams of Steel and Oil, Duress, or another Long Goodbye. So I like there's a lot of early game options. And the Frillbacks. The Frillbacks are a must right now for those multiple modes.
Fair. And I mean, Golgari Talent is slowly but surely getting tuned to handle what the meta is pushing its way. And I've seen it tuned a bunch of different ways, but I like where you've got a lot of this. So good option, great spot to be in coming into the weekend. But let's take a look at another one, and this one might surprise you because it's not on the tier list this week. Rakdos Lizards. So before I start, the sideboard guide for this is prepped and available for Coffee and Grinders members. I've been working on this. I've been tuning this. I think I'm currently 12-3 with this on the Mythic ladder, so it's done really well for me. I have a slightly different build than everybody else has been playing, so let's kind of talk about that. Usually you see the swampy Mudflat Village. We moved over to Rockface. Haste in an aggro deck is so much better. This also means that you have 14 black sources for turn 1, which is exactly where I want to be when I'm trying to hit that turn 1 duress or get into cut downs. It's important, because Cavern of Souls, you don't get to count for things like Duress, Torch the Tower, Deluge, or Urbrask's Forge. And Deluge, we're a little short on the number of black sources for that, but we are willing to take that risk in order to make sure we have perfect mana for the creature base, because it isn't necessarily a turn 3 play. Sometimes it's a turn 4 or 5 play. The Torch the Towers in the sideboard as well are very different. Most people are running cut downs. In a world filled with Mosswood Dread Knights and so many things you need to exile, I think Torch the Tower is just a stronger place to be. So I like where this version of it's positioned. Check it out, take it for a spin, enjoy the sideboard guide if you subscribe to Coffee and Grinders. It's going to be a fun ride.
I think this deck is a fun ride. I've been bested by this deck quite a few times on ladder. It looks very fun to play. I've tried it out a few times, and I got a quick 3-0 the other day with it. So yeah, I like to see where this deck is evolving, and I think Rockface Village is definitely the way to go. I think that's a good move. Wow, but that's it, folks. Another week in the books. Thank you all for supporting us. And a special shout out to our members who support the Rebellion by watching these videos all the way through. We try to reward that, and I hope that you enjoy our Ahead of the Curve segment. We'll be back next week. More analysis.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on this video. Remember, every click helps. So until next time, Rebels, untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.